Let me start straight away with one question which has been in the news recently, the last 10 days or so. Two distinguished leaders of corporate India have trashed the proposal to separate the position of the chairman from the chief executive, and I'm referring to Mr. Rahul Bajaj and Mr. Venu Srinivasan, both of whom were quoted in the papers on the same day as saying that this is completely out of sync with the ground realities in India, and that we should not be separating these posts. These are Western concepts being imported into India, etc. I know for a fact that there are corporate leaders in this audience who subscribe to the same view. But I know equally, and I see Mohandas Pai shaking his head, I know there are also people who strongly believe that the opposite is true. What are your views on this?
So that's a very interesting question to start with and very hotly debated just now. We have, for the longest time, had the role of MD and chairman as two separate roles. So I can't really imagine how it would be like to have both of those roles combined into one. I think there is, the difference in roles is very stark. The chairman obviously is looking at the broader context, strategic issues, strategic directions, also looking at heat risk maps to see how the company could get impacted by, by external, the external environment and what's happening in the world around. The MD is very much focused, or primarily his role is to focus, or her role is to focus on running the company on a day-to-day, month-to-month, yearly focus and escalate issues that are agreed upon in advance to the chairman. Having a chairman also means that you have access to someone who is above the management in case you have an issue that requires a resolution or at his or her level. So for me, this whole concept is something that is a given. I can't imagine how we would function with the MDs and companies' role, put together, amalgamated. I think there would be quite a it would be quite ironic to have both functions carried out by the same person.
There are elements to this which are facing an even bigger pushback. One, of course, is the basic question of separation. And then there are two other elements. Should the chairman be non-executive? I suppose if you separate, it follows from that the chairman must be non-executive, because you cannot have a managing director who's non-executive. I would hate to think of a company that has a non-executive managing director. So that follows from the separation. But the third, which is where I am hearing that corporate India is pushing back a lot, is the proposition that the chairman and the chief executive should not be related. And India is the first to prescribe something of this nature. This prescription doesn't exist anywhere in the world. I know it doesn't work.
Related to each other.
Chairman and the MD should not be related to each other. Father and son, mother and daughter, father and daughter maybe, I don't know. They shouldn't be related.
So, as you
maybe
would know,
brothers.
As you would know, in our context, very fortunate not to have brothers in...
Which is why I'm asking you this question. Because you can take an objective view. You don't have to be defensive about this. Yes. Okay.
But having said that, I dread to be in a situation like that. I mean, that would be an extremely complex situation to deal with, I would imagine. I'm sure there are many family-run companies in India which have a situation like that, and I guess the dynamics would be very different. I see that the concept of family councils has increased in India, where you have independent people advising families as to how to sort out any potential or existing conflict. So as far as we are concerned, since I'm the only one from the family who actually runs a business, every company would have an MD and a chairman who are not related. In fact, as a philosophy, if two people are related, they can't work in the same function for sure in any company, can't obviously be in the same line of authority and likely not to be in the same, so not to be in the finance function unless they're separated in terms of the part of the function that they're operating in.
The other issue which is very, very current is the prescription of a proficiency test for independent directors. Now, an independent director, no matter what his or her background is, qualification is, has to pass a proficiency test which comprises a paper in securities law, a paper in company law, and a paper in basic accountancy. And once you pass, you get 60% in that. Then it is believed that you are God's gift to the corporate boardroom, and that you will.
Is that really true, sir? Yeah.
Add value. No, it's prescribed. It's prescribed, it's ready. Some people are writing out the question papers. I hope they don't make it too difficult. Again, like you spoke about the separation because you could speak about it objectively, I can also speak about this objectively because those who've done more than 10 years on a board are exempted. So I'm 10 plus, and I don't have to prove whether I know this or not. It's not important. But I was joking to someone that my successors in SEBI, who headed SEBI after I did, and have therefore done less than 10 years, would all have to take examinations in securities law in order to stay on boards. Is this the answer to getting better directors on boards?
Not at all. Not at all. I think, sir, the things you're talking about are all,
yes.
Functional knowledge, which is about.
And India is the first
law,
country to do it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think sometimes innovation is not required. It seems you just, stick to the trusty old concepts that have come down over time. I think it's more about a person's track record, his experience, whether his experience is relevant to a part of the company's operations, if not generally overall to the space that the company operates in terms of strategy. In one of our companies, our product mix is changing, and the auto players are going to become more and more important as a customer segment. So we're looking to have a director who has experience in the auto segment, because that's a segment that's new to us. Some of our directors have held the positions of CEOs and have an outstanding record of running companies. Some are specialists in some cases, depending on the requirement of the company in terms of input. I don't think a test can really, a test for integrity, I don't think exists. Any other test is a functional test. I don't think either you or I or most senior people in this room would remember everything about security law, and I don't think that is required either for someone who's on the board. So I think it's more about the track record and the experience.
In fact,
and its relevance to the company that you're appointing he or she to the board on.
You have some very distinguished directors on your board, including a distinguished global management guru, who I understand is in the city today. I don't know whether he's done 10 years and whether he would, he's advised the top corporations of the world on how to run their businesses and been on their boards. He's written books that are global bestsellers. But I haven't checked with him whether he's done 10 years, whether he would get the exemption. But staying on the subject of independent directors, there is one school of thought which believes that over time, this category has not added value in the boardroom, and therefore they're completely dispensable. There's another category which believes that you got to empower them to be stronger in the boardroom than they are at this point of time. Do people like this need external props to empower them? Aren't they adequately empowered if they see themselves as empowered? Or do you see your independent directors as not contributing what they should be contributing in boardrooms?
I would like to think that there's a mixed bag. There are some who don't really bring much to the table. There are many others who not just bring their experience to their table, they also will go out of the way to do research or talk to people on topics that the board is grappling with. Many of them play a very effective role of being a conscience keeper to the company. And I think that in itself is a very important contribution that many of them make. I think their role in committees is normally very useful, whether it's the audit committee or the finance committee, the nomination and remuneration company. I see that we get some very valuable insights from several of them on these committees. These committees are empowered. A lot of the things that independent directors talk about, suggest, actually get implemented in a very institutionalized kind of a way. I think the idea of not having independent directors, again, is now a very alien idea in India. There was a time, so you know better, where you did not require independent directors, maybe up until the mid-80s, I would think. Then there are sort of layers to it in several of my contemporaries in global companies also have on their board the concept of a lead independent director, and his or her role is in a sense even more onerous on him or her and also on the company. So I think whilst we're a little away from getting into that kind of nuanced segregation of roles, the question of having independent directors, I don't think is under debate anymore.
There's another third issue that is again in the headlines in the last few days. Whistleblower complaints. Now, this is relatively new in India. It was a non-mandatory provision for some time. After that, some companies introduced it, but now everybody is required to have it. It's a fairly mixed bag. In theory, a good instrument. Is it playing out well in practice? Is there a lot of pressure on companies because whistleblowers have disproportionate power in the way the scheme is structured? What are your thoughts on that? Because there's a recent case that has raised the issue of timely disclosures. What constitutes timely disclosure to the exchanges when a whistleblower complaint is received?
So I think again it's a mixed bag. I mean, you need to have, in my view, very clearly articulated guidelines as to can there be anonymous complaints? Do complaints have to be accompanied by the name of the complainant? Can it be a complainant who, is it about just salary, wages, increments, so and so? Is it about misconduct or not complying with companies' values? I think one has to use one's judgment, whoever is the compliance officer, has to sieve through that, and you can't run after every complaint because that would become a wild goose chase. But I think you need someone who has the judgment, who also has, of course, the advantage of the wisdom of others in the company to pick up the right ones and bring it to the notice of the right people in the company. So I say you can't ignore them, but you've got to be careful not to start chasing ghosts, because that can be quite a counterproductive thing to do.
There's another issue which perhaps holds the solution to some of this, and that's the issue of board evaluations. What is your view on board evaluations? We've had this for the last few years now, and my experience is that in most companies, every director gets 11 out of 10 after peer evaluation. And yet, it used to be said in the service to which I belonged that Ravi Bhargav, my colleague, is here, Subramaniam is here, that in one state of the Indian Union, a fairly large populous state, everybody was graded outstanding, and the explanation was they were always standing outside the room, so they must be outstanding guys. So our board evaluations remind me of that kind of an evaluation system. It's prescribed, people are going through the motions, it's not adding up to anything. Is there a way that we can breathe life into this?
So in my experience in our companies, 5 years ago, we got, everyone was graded A or A+. Now I see some distinction happening in the sense that you would have board members who would say all independents average, all executives above, whatever, outstanding, and all whatever another category could do much better. So there is some distinction that's starting to happen, and I think that hesitance to actually call out performance is diminishing, but taking a very long time. I have always had 10 on 10, as you can imagine, as a chairman of all my companies, which is somewhat disappointing because that doesn't mean anything to me at all. I'd love to get some feedback, either formally or informally. So I think it's it's seen as of today as a statutory exercise that every company has to go through.
You think we will see a time when, on the basis of evaluation, some director will be told, thank you very much, but maybe you should spend your time elsewhere rather than be on this board?
I don't see that happening for a very long time, or
Is
if
this
at all
a
it happens.
cultural issue, or is it that having got somebody on the board, we think that we made the mistake, and if we persuade the gentleman or lady to leave, we are admitting that we failed in the first instance of getting that person?
I think it's a cultural issue. It's also, the fact that the mandate of this audit is to give people feedback on how they're doing in terms of their role as a board member, and so that they get objective feedback, they can contribute more, or there are specific areas in which they can contribute, or the chairman or MD needs to set the agenda, let's say, for board meetings more clearly, take charge of discussions, make sure that you're getting the right inputs, the right areas of focus from members of the committee. So I think it's more that kind of a role where the objective is to improve the productivity of the discussion of the members and get more participation from all the members on the board. I don't think that it's meant to be used as a mechanism where you actually ask a director of the board to actually leave the company.
It's interesting you say this because Schedule 4, which talks about evaluation in the Companies Act, says at the end of the evaluation, a decision should be taken whether the director should go or stay. And my problem with that has been that evaluation doesn't mean black or white. Somebody has some strengths, somebody has some areas for improvement. So you point to that person that these are the areas we want you to spend more time, more quality time, maybe read up more, maybe speak up more in board meetings, things of that kind. There are
we do have meetings twice a year only of independent directors. You come back, so we have meetings twice a year of only the independent directors who meet by themselves and come back and give feedback to management on what they think. That's more about strategy of the company and vision, where we are going, what we need to do more of, what we need to avoid, that sort of thing. But I think that is also recent in the last 2 or 3 years. And that I've found is a very value-adding exercise, because they have sometimes a context that management or us as promoters, being so close to the company and its operations, might just have hit a blind spot on. I think that is a very valuable contribution that independent directors can make.
There's another very, very important issue, and it is related to one of the issues that I raised earlier, which is the separation of the chairman and the MD. Are corporate boards paying enough attention to succession planning? I know it's being talked about a lot. 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I was at a meeting with a few people from industry, and when I raised the topic of succession planning, it was an informal discussion. I understood for the first time what pin drop silence meant. You could have actually heard a pin drop that day when I mentioned succession planning. So the things have moved on. There are companies that are addressing it. Is enough happening? Are they going about the right
You're talking about succession planning in the management?
At the level of the CXOs, at the level of the MD, the KMPs. Are these being thought through?
We are at a stage, sir, where when there is need for a change, whether someone has been asked to leave on account of performance or there is a retirement happening, at that point in time, we would bring several profiles to the NRC to start with, who would then recommend to the board. And we'd have a very extensive discussion around at least 2 or 3 different profiles. Hopefully one from outside, 2 from inside is the kind of a metric that we kind of want to follow. But I don't think that we have a system of discussing succession planning for the next 5 years.
Okay.
And I doubt most Indian companies do. I think that a lot of us don't do it even internally, leave alone taking it to the board.
Because the real problem area is when it comes to succession planning, when you have a promoter managing director. And leaving one's position doesn't come easily to most people in India. Even if you are an executive chairman moving to non-executive, it doesn't come easily to people. We've seen several instances of people who want to stay on. We've seen instances of people who want to redefine what non-executive meant even as they make the transition. So we've lived through all of those problems. But how do you ensure that corporate India looks at this a little more seriously? Mandating is not the answer. Is there some other way in which, because succession planning is serious and I don't think it's getting enough attention. And
you're saying in particular on succession planning?
Succession planning. How does one ensure that that gets attention and becomes streamlined? Not that one person is forward-looking, is, let's say, more understanding of the future needs of the company and therefore does it, but if he or she goes, the next person says, no, this is a matter of minor detail, my job is to run the business. So how do you ensure that a good system is put in place for this?
To be discussed at the board.
On the board. I know Santrupt is here, maybe.
Maybe I should direct the question to
maybe
him.
on the way back.
No, I don't think you can really ensure a quality standard of discussion. You could mandate that succession planning is discussed at a board once a year, for example, or once in 2 years, which means it will find a place in the agenda for the meeting. But the quality of discussion is something that can't be mandated, as you would know.
No, that is true.
And that depends very much on the chairman, CEO, how well planned they are, also how much they value the opinions of the board members, especially the independent board members.
Another major area which has been neglected for many years but has been talked about in the last few years is risk management. Are boards today equipped in terms of their understanding of the business, in terms of their understanding of the wide range of risks, to look at risk management? Because I know in some companies there is this issue of management's taking the position, we understand risk. The independents on the board don't understand risk, therefore we will address risk and you stay out of this. There are also companies where independent directors lead risk management committees of the board in order to address this in a somewhat dispassionate way, not get involved in that. Do you think there is enough capacity in the boardroom to address risk?
Some of the board companies that we have a risk management committee, not all do, but I think that it's something that management has to track and has to track in a very systematic way. We have something that we call the risk heat map, where we segregate risks into 4 different quadrants, depending on the possibility of those actualizing and the impact of those, which is discussed at a management level every quarter. But I think it's important as part of the induction of a director to apprise him or her of the different risks that a company is exposed to, whether it's technology risk, whether it is whatever the risk might be from a competitive landscape point of view. And it's important that the management, the CEO keep the board apprised of developments on that front. We would see a heat risk map at least twice a year in the board, where the CRO, the chief risk officer, if not the CEO, would talk about any movements within the heat risk map. So, for example, we in Novelis, which is aluminum rolling company, we figured out from seeing the heat risk map that there is a new technology that steel is developing, that would, the lightweight steel, the main advantage of aluminum versus steel is that it's much lighter. And we figured from there that that wasn't something that had been highlighted by the management to the board. And we picked that up as being a very important criteria for competition in the future, which in turn gave way to a series of developments. We're now taking that as a very important exercise project in our development center. And I think about a couple of $100 million have been spent, because that is protecting your competitive advantage as aluminum vis-a-vis steel. So I think how you interpret a risk heat map becomes a very important element, and also it can be a tool that can be very useful in terms of providing information that sometimes would otherwise have not just made it to the radar.
Shifting to another area completely, your group has been very active in the CSR space. Long before CSR was mandated or talked about, you've been doing what today is called CSR. You've been doing it already. If you look at the journey of CSR, initially came the Voluntary Code of Conduct. In the Companies Act, it was the only provision where they said comply or explain. There were no penal consequences attached to that. You had to go and explain shortfalls to shareholders. Then the ministry decided that comply or explain meant explain to the ministry, not explain to the shareholders. So you imported a concept from Britain, but switched it to mean explain to the ministry in terms of shortfalls, and they very quickly compiled a list of all of those who were below that percentage and what the amounts were, clearly intended to go into the general coffers, I imagine, or some such thing. Now we are finding further changes in the CSR prescriptive arrangement. Do you think, firstly, it ought to have been mandated? Because I've always believed CSR is an affair of the heart, not an accounting entry. It's not about percentages. It is what you believe to be right, and you do that. And it doesn't matter if you are short by a few hundred rupees or excess by a few hundred, it doesn't matter. But the swings now that you have on CSR, I think over the last 1 year itself, there have been 2 major changes in the policy framework. Is that the way we should be looking at CSR?
I actually think it's worked out quite well. So you always have, in the case of a new concept like CSR, there will be some amount of abuse, which I'm sure exists. But I find that a lot of companies, whatever is the 2%, the amount that it works out to, actually are looking out to contribute, even if in a small way, very often to a cause that is, dear to the employees of the company, or to an initiative where some of the employees would like to spend their own time and their own money also. I actually think it's been a very good addition in the mandate that has been set out for companies. So if you think about it, in the Anglo-Western world, we don't have enough research in India, but if you look at research in the Anglo-Western world, I think that after the church, the biggest constituent of society is actually becoming the corporations. And therefore, the expectations from corporations to give back, to help build a richer planet, for example, to remove some of the inequalities that exist, especially in the case of a very stratified society, is actually going up and up. And the expectations from corporations, as you would know, are becoming more and more complex. So I think giving back, and very frankly, giving back is not just a good thing in terms of an altruistically good thing. I also find that I've actually seen this myself, and I've also read research, as you would have, to say that companies that do good, are good corporate citizens, actually get valued higher as well. So from a very clinical point of view, it makes sense just on the numbers part of it as well.
And on climate change, what is corporate India doing? Is it playing a leadership role in understanding the problem, to explaining to the less privileged that this is a serious problem? What does each one of us need to do? Maybe simple thing like reducing carbon footprint. It sounds simple, not that simple, but is corporate India taking a leadership role in this, or should it be taking a leadership role?
Here, I think it's been mandated, so we don't have a choice. What we need to do, what we have done, is study more and more of technologies available. We're spending much more in terms of capex on, CO2 emissions and other sustainability issues than we ever have in the past. In fact, I saw this year that we've actually cut back on some capex and allocated those funds to investing on sustainability initiatives. My only issue or my only contention is that you have some areas which are mandated to have norms which don't exist anywhere in the world. So I think we need to strike a balance. You can't tell me that your emission norm has to be X when no one else in the world is able to meet that norm. And worse still, there doesn't exist a technology by which you can achieve X. I mean, you can only achieve up to X plus 20%. So I think whilst it's a good initiative, whilst it's got us thinking, whilst it's got us spending in the right direction, as any corporate of repute would do, I think that the mandate that is given in terms of the levels that are set need to become more realistic and also graded over a period of time. The expectations that you can adopt all of this in the course of 1 year or 2 years, as compared to the several years that your Western counterparts have taken, is, I think, unrealistic. And that's what needs to be looked into.
What about investor education? I know this is something that you have thought about, that if the average investor is not educated, you will get very poor investment decisions by them, and then they will blame the corporates for underperformance, and then it builds increasing distrust and all of that. Do you find enough reach out to the average investor in terms of explaining where the company is headed? Or is this annual forum that is available, the AGM, is it that becoming a kind of a ritual without a worthwhile conversation with the shareholders that bother to turn up and the management? Is there a lot of
I'm sure
shadow
all of us
boxing?
who've been at AGMs know that there's nothing much that happens at AGMs. There's no information.
Poetry is there.
There's poetry, there's flowers, there's sometimes abuse as well.
Yes.
Comments on the quality of the pictures in the annual report. So there's no qualitative discussion that happens. Investor education, it has to be a continuous exercise. So in our case, we would have a small team of 2 people maybe in each company and most companies would have that, who only do investor relation the whole year round. So investor relations is obviously a very important function that the corporate function division or normally a separate IR division needs to perform. And I think it's becoming almost, run of the mill that you need to have a certain number of non-deal roadshows or whatever you might call them. We would actually compile which investors were met by who in the course of the year, the kind of discussions that were had, the concerns the investors had, and the manner in which they were addressed. So I think that's become a very important role of management. And again, we are spending much more time on that than we've ever done in the past.
I have 8 minutes on the clock for this session to end, and Mr. Birla is keen on taking 1, maybe 2 questions if the first question is crisp and short. It would depend on that. Yeah. Anyone who has a question for Mr. Birla? Yes, please. You'll get a mic quickly. You should get a mic soon, I think. Yes.
So recently read a report in the newspapers which said a large percentage of independent directors are actually resigning from their posts.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Large percentage.
Are resigning from the boards, independent.
Are resigning from their post because they're worried about the implied liability that they carry as independent directors. And I was very perturbed by that. Do you have any comments to make on that?
I agree. I think that the role of, in many aspects, the role of the independence is becoming way too onerous for someone who at the end of the day isn't spending his all of his or her time, looking at the running of the company. But I think, again, it's up to the company to give them comfort from the kind of disclosures that they make and the kind of, comfort that they can give to independents about the governance standards that exist in the company. But I think that, from what I understand, is a balance that needs to be struck even in companies in the US and Europe. That's a constant struggle. I think that more and more independent directors have to carry a more onerous role vis-a-vis minority shareholders, for sure.
The good news is that a large number of offenses under company law are going to be decriminalized. So therefore, you could get hit hard, but you may not have become a state guest. So that yeah, Mohan.
We've seen regulatory overreach in the last 2-3 years. Regulators pass laws which are an overreach, and all these regulations hurt good companies who are following the norms. They don't prevent the bad companies from changing. Now, what should we do to have a appropriate level of regulations?
You meant last 3 years only?
Well, I'm being...
Okay, right.
Well, I'm not being politically correct.
If you had said last 20 years, I would have winced, but anyway.
Okay. I didn't get the question.
No, I'm saying there is regulatory overreach in industry today. There's too much of regulations coming, too much of criminalization. Something is being rolled back. But they're not able to catch the bad guys who do all the work and get away. And many of them get away literally. But the problem is, for the good companies who follow norms, it creates such a big burden of fear, of not being able to follow, of this thing that you're going to miss something. What is the appropriate level of regulation? How should we handle this issue about regulators need to regulate and companies needing to be good citizens?
No, maybe I'll take that question, because whatever Mr. Birla might have done in his life, he's not been a regulator.
Sure enough.
Okay. No, I think, Mohan, the answer is very simple. The laws are written for bad people, not for good people. And you can't have different sets of laws. So long as there are bad people, good people will pay the price. It's as simple as that, because you got to write laws for bad people.
I think the bigger issue also, or another issue also, is that of the multiplicity of regulators in a sector, and having to provide the same information to different people, or different people asking the same thing from different perspectives, or you can get caught out by one regulator, not another. So it's a bit of, being a cat on a hot tin roof, which I think is not a very desirable thing.